Good evening and welcome to this Friday edition of Scotland at 7. I'm Ruth Watson. My guest this evening is Serena Cowdy, the newly elected SNP councillor for Arbroath. Before we get round to our chat with Serena about the news and current affairs of today, here's today's headlines. The Ukraine update, day 142. At least 23 people, including 3 children, were killed and up to 66 others wounded after Russian missiles struck civilian buildings and a cultural centre in the centre of Vinnytsia in central Ukraine. The attack on Vinnytsia, far from the war's front lines, occurred mid-morning on Thursday when the streets were full of people. 11 bodies, including 2 children, remain unidentified after yesterday's strike in Vinnytsia. Ihor Dozhovka, deputy head of the Office of the President of Ukraine, said more than 70 people are still in hospital and 18 people are missing and the rescue operation is going on. Investigators are asking the relatives of those missing following the attack to submit DNA samples in order to confirm the identities of the bodies. Russia's Ministry of Defense has claimed, without providing any evidence, that Thursday's missile strike in Vinnytsia was aimed at a military target. In its daily operational briefing, the ministry claimed the strike had hit a building housing a meeting of the Ukrainian Air Force Command. Ukraine has rejected Russian claims that any military target was hit. President Zelensky called the Russian attack on Vinnytsia an open act of terrorism. In a video address at the Hague conference on Thursday, he urged European and international criminal court officials. Russian and pro-Russian separatist forces of the so-called Luhansk People's Republic claim to have entered the outskirts of Seversk in the Donbass, the UK Ministry of Defence have said. Acknowledging that reports have not been corroborated, the ministry says this will open a pathway onwards to Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. The British aid worker Paul Urey, 45, has died while being held hostage by pro-Russia separatists in the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic, a local official in the rebel-held territory has said. Urey was reportedly detained at a checkpoint in southern Ukraine in April with a fellow Briton, Dylan Healy. The 2 men were later charged with mercenary activities by separatists in the rebel-held Donetsk People's Republic. The UK has summoned Russia's ambassador to London, Andrei Kelin, to express deep concern over the reports of the death of Urey. In a statement, Britain's Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, said Russia must bear full responsibility for his death. Ukraine is hurrying as fast as we can to clinch a deal with Russia, Turkey and the UN next week to export grain via its Black Sea ports, according to a senior Ukrainian official. Russia's defense ministry said an agreement aimed at resuming Ukraine's Black Sea grain exports was close. New satellite images showing an expanding mass grave site in the Russian-occupied Ukrainian city of Mariupol, according to a report published by the UK-based Centre for Information of Resilience. Investigators at CIR used satellite images to determine that approximately 1,400 new graves were added at the Mariupol Starokrizmske cemetery between the 12th of May and 29th of June. The Met Office has issued an amber extreme heat weather warning for Scotland on Monday, July the 18th and Tuesday, July the 19th. This warning impacts mainly southern areas of Scotland, including Dumfries, Peebles, Wigtown and Kelso. In a statement, the Met Office said a hot spell is likely to develop from Sunday, likely peaking early next week, leading to widespread impacts on people and infrastructure. Alongside Scotland being issued an amber extreme heat weather warning, some parts of England were issued with an even more concerning red heat warning. The Met Office described it as an exceptional hot spell on Monday and Tuesday, leading to widespread impacts on people and infrastructure. This is mainly across central England, with parts of London, Essex and Yorkshire also included. It's been yet another busy day in Westminster as a Tory leadership candidate took part in the Conservative Home Blog's Zoom-based hustings. The 5 hopefuls go again tonight, live on Channel 4 at 7:30 p.m. MPs on the Commons Privileges Committee will carry out a site visit in Downing Street and are demanding Number 10 hands over evidence, including WhatsApp, photos and diary entries, as they investigate whether Boris Johnson misled Parliament over Partygate. Tory party leadership hopeful Penny Mordaunt claimed her rivals were trying to stop her, but declined to join in criticising other candidates. Speaking to Sky News Friday morning, she said she was aware that she'd threat to her rivals, Chancellor Rishi Sunak and Foreign Secretary Liz Truss, if she made it to the final vote by party members. Meanwhile, Truss has sought to breathe new life into her faltering campaign with a flurry of tax-cutting proposals worth billions of pounds, as the 5 remaining candidates took part in their first mass debate before a televised event on Channel 4 on Friday evening. Truss and 4 other would-be successors to Boris Johnson joined a Zoom-based Q&A hosted by the Conservative Home website. Sunak, Mordaunt and Tom Tugendhat have committed to maintaining the government's legally binding goal of reaching net zero emissions by 2050. The contenders for the Tory leadership have signed up to a series of pledges put forward by the Conservative Environment Network, including continuing with the post-Brexit nature-friendly farming subsidies and switching to renewable energy. Mordaunt, a leading contender to become Prime Minister, has, analysis of her parliamentary records and public comments shows, that doesn't quite read, sorry. Homeopathy is a treatment based on the use of diluted substances that practitioners claim can cause the body to heal itself. I'm afraid I'm not quite sure where that sentence comes into this report, but we'll go with it. Boris Johnson is planning to stage parliamentary interventions on Ukraine, Brexit and levelling up, with allies of the outgoing Prime Minister hinting that those are the areas of his legacy he believes to be the most under threat from his potential successor. Channel 4 has said an investigation into allegations made by the Culture Secretary, Nadine Dorries, that a reality TV show she appeared on used paid actors. The broadcaster asked producers of the 2010 reality show Tower Block of Commons, in which Dorries was one of a number of MPs who went to live in deprived communities, to investigate the claims she made to the Culture Select Committee in May. The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, visited a section of the Berlin Wall earlier today while on a trip to the German capital to meet politicians and business leaders. Starmer was pictured by the landmark erected in 1961 by the communist authorities to separate East and West Berlin. Boris Johnson was today ordered to hand a vast cache of evidence to the probe into whether he lied to Parliament over Partygate. The Privileges Committee demanded diaries for the 8 days he attended COVID lockdown-busting gatherings in Downing Street, which led to more than 100 fines from police. MPs also ordered photos, internal notes, the PM's briefing packs, emails, resignation statements and door logs, and warned the list could be expanded further at a later date. Powerful Chair Harriet Harman, the Labour veteran, set an autumn 15th deadline for the number 10 to serve up the documents, before Boris Johnson hands his resignation to the Queen on September the 6th. Harriet Harman ordered the nation's top civil servant to let her committee visit 10 Downing Street to inspect where the parties happened. In correspondence released today, Ms. Harman stressed she was not seeking to attribute blame to staff or former staff. She added, witnesses who wish to remain anonymous can give evidence about whether the Prime Minister lied. The committee is investigating whether Boris Johnson committed contempt of Parliament by misleading MPs over what he knew about number 10 parties. The SNP has today called every current Tory leadership candidate toxic for the future of Scottish trade, as they try to outdo each other on implementing an extreme Brexit. Scotland's exports to European countries are worth around £16.4 billion to the Scottish economy, and Scotland's food and drink sector alone currently accounts for the largest share of UK food and drink exports. However, the SNP is slamming the Tory leadership candidates for their obsession with Brexit, despite repeated warnings from economists that the UK is lagging behind the rest of the G7 in pandemic trade recovery. UK business investment trailing behind other industrialised countries, and the OECD predicting the USA will have the slowest growth in the G20 next year, apart from war-sanctioned Russia. Minette Batters, the NFU president for England and Wales, also condemned Westminster's post-trade deals, saying, "Time and time again, we said they are going to cause harm, and that was ignored." Only last month, a report by the Resolution Foundation highlighted the devastating impact of Brexit. lower wages, reduced productivity, and a shrinking economy. The report concluded that Brexit is making the UK poorer and will see a reduction in productivity and wages in the decade ahead. Commenting, SNP MSP Jim Fairley said, Scotland's trade has an incredible amount of potential, but it's clear that being subject to Westminster control has held us back from reaching our full potential. The damage being caused to Scotland's trade by the Tory UK government has only become worse as a result of Brexit, and being ripped out of the European single market, increasing barriers both to freedom of movement and to trade with the largest single market in the world. This is now set to be compounded by the fact that the UK is threatening to provoke a catastrophic trade dispute with the EU over the Northern Ireland Protocol. Mr Fairley continued, the SNP government is using all the powers we currently have to protect our trade from the damage of Brexit, but as an independent country, Scotland can rid itself of the consequences of a Brexit and Tory government we did not vote for, and have the full powers to protect our interests, markets and producers. SNP MP Stuart MacDonald's bill to introduce paid leave for parents with a baby in neonatal care takes another step towards becoming law, with its second reading in the House of Commons today. The Neonatal Care Leave and Pay Bill, which has been backed by Bliss, the leading charity for premature and sick babies, as well as the UK government, could help thousands of families across Scotland and the UK every year by ensuring all parents of premature and sick babies are entitled to additional paid maternity and paternity leave. If passed, it will introduce a new entitlement to parents who qualify for statutory maternity, paternity, and adoption leave and pay. Qualifying parents would be entitled to additional paid leave from work if their baby spends more than 7 or more consecutive days being cared for in a health setting before they reach 28 days of life. Leave and pay will be available for the duration of their baby's care for up to 12 weeks. Commenting ahead of the bill's second reading, SNP MP Stuart MacDonald said, no parent should have to choose between being with their premature or sick baby in neonatal care and having to return to work to earn a living, or between enjoying the full benefits of parental leave and going back to work. With the cost of living soaring, it is more important than ever that we secure an urgent change in the law so that parents of babies in neonatal care get the paid leave and support they need at an incredibly challenging time. I'm delighted to bring forward this bill with the backing of Bliss and families all across Scotland and the UK, Stuart MacDonald concluded. In a statement issued today by Amar Anwar, lawyer on behalf of his clients, the family of the late Al-Megrahi said, we have been advised that the application seeking permission to appeal the decision made by the High Court of Justiciary on the 15th of January 2021 over the conviction of the late Al-Megrahi for the Lockerbie bombing has been refused by the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom. Having consulted with my client, Ali El-Megrahi, this is not the end of the matter. On the 21st of December 1988, 270 people from 21 countries were murdered in the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, the worst terrorist atrocity ever committed in the United Kingdom. Since then, the case of Abdel Basit Al-Megrahi, the only man ever convicted of the crime, has been described as the worst miscarriage of justice in British legal history. The appeal was commenced in 2007, but following the diagnosis of terminal cancer of Mr. Megrahi, it was suddenly abandoned in 2009. Mr. Amar Anwar said, the reputation of the Scottish criminal justice system has suffered badly both at home and internationally because of widespread doubts about the conviction of Mr. Al-Megrahi. ScotRail has confirmed that rail services across Scotland will return to a full timetable from next Wednesday. There have been reduced journeys across Scotland for almost 2 months because of a pay dispute, but drivers recently accepted a 5% increase. About 700 services were cut on the 23rd of May when the dispute began and an emergency timetable was introduced. Dave Simpson, ScotRail Service Delivery Director, said it had been a challenging few months. It is a big step forward to reach such a positive resolution and continue in our efforts to provide the safest, greenest and most reliable railway we can. We thank customers for their patience through this period, Mr Simpson said. A collaboration led by the Highlands and Islands Enterprise alongside members of Space Scotland will highlight the country's growing space industry. A group of Scottish space companies will attend Farnborough Airshow to show off what the country's space sector has to offer the UK. The collaboration, led by Highlands and Islands Enterprise, contains representatives from satellite, launch and spaceport companies from across Scotland. Following the formation of Space Scotland to promote the country's space research, heritage and commercial new space activity, the industry-led group of over 50 space companies, formerly known as the Scottish Space Leadership Council, will feature as an exhibitor in the Space Zone. Participants will showcase Space Scotland's collaborative approach, including the group's bonds with academia and both Scottish Government and UK governmental bodies, such as the UK Space Agency, while seeking new international partners and inward investment. A recent survey of firms by the UK Space Agency found that Scotland accounted for one-fifth of all UK space sector employment, the highest proportion of space jobs in the sector compared to other parts of the UK. Nick O'Connor, Programme Director at Prestwick Spaceport and part of the organising team, added, Scotland's space industry punches well above its weight. I put this down to three things: fantastically innovative companies, established academic base, and cross-government support. The key to success is collaboration. Farnborough International Airshow will enable us to display Scotland's capabilities and show the world how we are working together to achieve our collective ambition. Well, it is with great pleasure that I introduce Serena Cowdy, her first outing on Broadcasting Scotland. Good evening, Serena. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, I mean, looking at the international stage and looking at Ukraine and the impact of the war, both within Ukraine but also its effects elsewhere, do you have a particular perspective on the impacts and what this sort of the wider ramifications, sort of both for Ukraine but also for the international community?
Well, I think what was interesting today was a discussion I was having with someone around how the countries immediately surrounding Ukraine have stepped up in such an incredible way and taken huge numbers of people who are in need, immediate need, seeking asylum, and it's been very interesting and very heartening to see what countries like Poland, very small countries, Moldova, many others in the immediate vicinity have done. And that's actually incredibly inspiring to me and something that I think the wider international community, including many of us in Western Europe, should see as something to emulate and to really try and sort of live up to. I know that certain countries, the US and Westminster government, make a lot of play of the weapons and support in that respect we're giving to Ukraine. And I think that's correct that we're doing that. But I think it's also worth highlighting and applauding the day to day efforts and welcome that these countries have been giving for months now in a very real and tangible way. Obviously, that's the kind of a positive thing to highlight, but more widely, I think my concern is that we need to put a focus on the war in Ukraine in a very continued and constant manner as it drops off the news cycles a little bit, because you can see that when wars begin and it's in the public eye right at the start, everybody's very focused on it. And I think the whole international community just needs to keep focused on it and keep stepping up and committing until this is finished, because I think the values and the ideals that the people of Ukraine are fighting for are absolutely fundamental to the way of life that we want, all of us.
How significant do you think it is that Ukraine's membership of the EU is being expedited?
I think it's very significant in a symbolic sense, and that symbolism is extremely important. It shows the way that Ukraine has been wanting to go for a long time, and the values, as I say, the values that it wants to hold dear and strengthen within its own country, the values around freedoms for minorities, around being part of the kind of democratic union that the EU offers. And so I think it's absolutely excellent that it is being expedited. Albeit, I appreciate for many people living under constant bombardment and shelling, it inevitably isn't going to be top of their minds just now.
the 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 Scottish super sponsor scheme has been so successful that the First Minister was saying the other day that they had to pause it in order to make sure that people were the I think 3 times the amount of people that initially were thought would be coming over here could be put into more permanent housing and settled. Um, I know that even in my small community we now have got Ukrainian refugees in the local primary school and families being made welcome. Um, have you come across much experience in your area of people stepping up and welcoming people?
So I know for a fact that we do have a Ukrainian family actually very close to where I live in Arbroath, and they've come over as part of that. What's interesting is that there's small communities in Scotland who, I think it's Aberfeldy, who have understood that ideally they want to create an atmosphere where Ukrainian families and individuals have other Ukrainian families and individuals um, within that community so that they feel that they can have some familiarity. So I think actually a challenge um, in Angus and the surrounding areas would be creating that sense of community, not just us reaching out and making it a welcoming environment, but ideally having a situation where um, groups of Ukrainian families can be put together or in close contact with each other, so they have that element of familiarity as well. So I'd be really keen to see that happening on the super sponsor pause. I can imagine what a horribly difficult decision that was to make. I think it's a testament to how successful the scheme has been, and I think um, the focus and the priority needs to be on the scheme running in a way that is managed and safe, and all the checks are being carried out, and that when Ukrainians are being homed in Scotland, it's in very good quality and a sustainable manner. So I can completely see why the pause is needed. But of course, it would have been a hard decision to make.
Do you think that this gives Scotland an opportunity to have a refreshed conversation amongst ourselves about the kind of welcome we want to give refugees, no matter where those people have come from? There is no such thing as an illegal asylum seeker. It is legal to come to any country and to make a claim for asylum. And obviously, it is said that in an independent Scotland, we would be able to make our own policies for immigration and to create safe routes where people can come and have a safe means of coming to this country to claim asylum. Um, as Kenmore Street and other places have shown, many Scots are not don't it does not the hostile environment does not sit comfortably with us. What kind of conversations are you hearing, or would you like to see about the wider Scottish perspective on the conversation around asylum and refugees?
Yeah, so I think the fact that Scotland has long been against the kind of as a in democratic terms voted against the kind of hostile environment policies of the Westminster government. That is something I'm very proud of. It's something that I'm proud of the party, the SNP, for really having a very strong line on that and being very welcoming in its both its rhetoric and its actions towards asylum seekers. But I think we can't I think the main challenge is not to sort of rest on our laurels in that respect and say, isn't it wonderful? We are so welcoming in relation to other parts of the UK, because I think even here there's a perception of some asylum seekers to be slightly different to other asylum seekers, and I think um, it's a natural instinct of humans to feel more in common with people who are like them, whether that's because they look like them or they're from communities they perceive to be more like them. I think it's something that you have to fight against, and I think you have to um, make the environment and the education system and the welfare system as easy as possible to access for people from a range of different backgrounds, culturally and socially. So I think I just want to make sure that an independent Scotland really had that in the front and center of their minds, and that would include language support, a really deep sense of cultural understanding of where people are from, and everything like that.
Do you think that the recent programme about the recent revelations about Mo Farah having come as a trafficked child, and Mo Farah isn't even the poor man's name, do you think that that kind of, I mean, it must have been an extremely brave and painful thing for him to speak out in the way that he did. One can only imagine why he felt now was a good time to do that, given the situation facing many people with deportations and the like. Do you think that these are the kinds of conversations we need to be having so that people can really start to understand why people might take the make the choices they do, or in Mo Farah's case, he didn't have a choice; he was just trafficked.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think human trafficking and modern day slavery is something that we don't talk enough about. Huge numbers of people are involved in that. A very large proportion are either women, very sadly, largely trafficked in the sex trade, or children. Um, and it's absolutely shocking. And when I saw the news about Mo Farah, as you say, it's not even his real name. Um, I thought how horribly sad, how desperate, and also the fact that it did shock me, and it would have shocked a lot of others. It will have had a positive effect in that respect, because it's somebody he's so revered and respected, and in his area of expertise, and for even him to be explaining that happened to him, I think that will really stick in people's minds. So I completely agree. It was a very courageous thing to do, and I hope it will affect change.
Yeah, I remember I was spent far too much time on Twitter, and I saw somebody make the observation that it's a sign of the respect that and the decency of the people around Mo Farah when he was a youngster and these revelations were made, that it's taken this time for the news to come out, that nobody leaked it. So it's good to see there's some good in the world out there. Um,
Yeah.
moving on to the weather, you looking at the news reports of amber and red warnings of heat coming forward, it would appear that the warnings of the climate emergency are coming fast upon us. I know that you're a very committed environmentalist, and you've done a lot of work trying to sort of support Scotland's native wildlife. Um, what are your views on the way in which this is being reported? This kind of like, hey, it's a lovely hot sunny day ahead of us when half of Europe is burning.
Yeah, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think the rhetoric and the conversation around it is it's very frustrating, and it really worries me. And funnily enough, I hear it almost every morning when you've got the radio on, and the weather forecaster says, "Well, the good news is it's going to be warm and dry," and you think, well, you know, that's very pejorative. It's good news for people that want it to be warm and dry. It's pretty bad news for the the environment, and the fact that it's not couched in terms of climate change, climate emergency, the fact that we're not consistently being helped to understand that this is a climate crisis that's happening, and that's why you're having so many dry, sunny days to lie on the beach. It does worry me. Um, in terms of what can be done about it, I think humans have the great potential to act in the right way when they genuinely feel like something is an emergency. So we saw that with the COVID pandemic. Of course, mistakes were made by countries all over the world, but isn't it amazing how quickly we managed to come up with a vaccine for COVID? And isn't it amazing how everyone came together and um, really excel themselves in terms of what humans are capable of? It doesn't seem that this is being considered an emergency in the same way. And um, I can see why that is, because it's not happening in the next 3 months, but it is happening within our lifetimes, let alone our children's lifetimes. If you look at the flooding projections for the coast of Angus, where I live, even by 2050, when I very much hope to still be alive, many parts of our coastline are going to be underwater. So it's not an abstract concept in the way I think some people like to think it is.
I saw a Met Office comment again on Twitter where they were saying that they showed a heat map of Scotland and well, the UK, and they said this is what we were forecasting for 2050. We thought that this was perhaps, and it was showing almost exactly the weather pattern for today. So
Yeah.
all of this sort of sort of climate neutral sort of project zero by 2030, that's if the predictions for 2050 are happening in 2022. uh, we're looking at Portugal with the fires happening all across it. We're looking at Germany last year. Yesterday they sort of passed the anniversary of the terrible flooding where so many people lost their lives. um, I mean, it's kind of happening around us now, and you can't lie on the beach when it's 40 degrees because basically, you're going to fry your brain. I lived in Australia. I've lived with 40-degree heat. I know how difficult that can be, and that's in countries
Yeah.
where the housing and the infrastructure is set up for the extreme heat. So when we're in a climate emergency, when fuel bills are going up, how are people supposed to be keeping cool? I guess this isn't a big issue for us in Scotland still because it's still not too bad, but I'm looking at fields that haven't had water for a while. I'm looking at a spring that was unseasonably dry, high winds that we've been having right the way through the year, which are very similar to what we would be having um, in the winter rather than in the summer. So it seems to me as though there's quite a lot of sort of wildlife and farming and people under pressure already. How do we
Yeah.
get this message across?
The thing is, so often with environmental issues, I think people relate to very tangible, specific examples. So people love hedgehogs. If they see hedgehogs are in distress, if they see that the hedgehogs are dying because there's not enough water, which in some cases they are, um, people's heartstrings being pulled is a way that messages are got across. That's one example. I used to work in communications for conservation charities, and you can see that people donate and people engage when they're given very small, sometimes very small, easily understandable stories about what's happening and what's suffering and what's being affected. The problem is this is such a huge crisis affecting countries all over the world. How do you distill that into something which people engage with, people understand the urgency of, but people don't just freeze in terror about? Because when something's so serious, it's like an existential threat to all of us. I think there is a natural human instinct to disengage because the reality is too much for us to cope with. So it's that finding that balance. It's finding, I think one thing is helping people understand how they can do positive things in a small way so that they are, whether it's putting water out for the birds, whether it's leaving their garden to be more wildlife friendly, buying local food, not having it shipped across the world. I think that's the way you get people to engage. But my worry is that it's not engaging them with a sense of emergency that we really need to.
So if we start off with the slogan "Too hot for hedgehogs" and go from there, that's all well
Yeah.
and good for us as individual punters. But I mean, how do we force our governments into action? We're looking at more and more governments looking because of the war in Ukraine and the embargo on Putin's oil and the Nord Stream project closing. Um, we're looking at coal mines being opened again. We're looking at people talking about fracking again. We're looking at people talking about nuclear, which is a pretty catastrophic sector to be trying to expand upon. How how do we as individuals enforce or encourage our governments to say, no, you have to take you have to find ways of putting renewables to the fore? How do we encourage our governments? And would that be any different or would that be any better in an independent Scotland?
Well, I think the every 5 years in most countries, 4 years, every couple of days in Westminster, seemingly, you get to vote in an election. And that is obviously why people say, oh, democracy comes around once every 5 years. So I think in environmental terms, I'm very pleased in Scotland that we have um, uh, an agreement between the Greens and the SNP. They are in government. So we have said at the ballot box that we take the environment seriously. You're quite right with regard to Ukraine and other Im- immediate emergency priorities. The worry is that we're going to roll back and we're going to start, whether it's oil fields that we were not going to utilize and we're now considering, or whether it's, as you say, people discussing fracking as a possibility. Um, that's in my opinion, that's out of the frying pan into the fire, because we're setting up an even bigger, if that's possible, existential problem than the Ukraine war or the cost of living crisis for ourselves by doing that. So I wish I had an easy answer as to how we can convince governments to stick to their guns in environmental terms. Um, but in terms of an independent Scotland, and I mean, I think that that's almost an easier question to answer, because we do have, I think it's 60% of the onshore wind renewable potential in the whole of the UK. We have such a enormous resource when it comes to renewable energy, the wave power, the wind power, um, and we need to be able to use that and build our country on that basis and have that as the bedrock of our energy policy, and not be tied into the system of the UK, which, of course, as we know, will be taking much of that renewable power for themselves. So I think that's one very obvious way that an independent Scotland can more easily achieve its environmental objectives.
You've recently been elected to Angus Council. I know that you're still, you're also sort of finding your feet, sort of taking back the administration from the Tory incumbents that were running it for a short while before you. Uh, is there any inclination? Do you have any inclination of how high on the agenda, um, where on the agenda the green issues and what the council might be looking to do to find ways to make Angus a more environmentally friendly place to live and perhaps deal with the climate emergency locally as far as we can?
So personally, I'm very fortunate. I've been given the role of environment spokesperson in the administration, and I'm actually environment and active travel spokesperson, which obviously covers the transition from using cars to walking and cycling wherever possible. So I'm very focused on the kind of issues you've raised. Um, in microcosm, the council's challenges are very similar to the challenges you highlighted at national level. So, facing a cost of living crisis, the council's finances are pretty tight. So, we've got to do exactly what I said national governments do. We've got to hold the line and stick to our environmental goals that we as an administration are very committed to more sustainable, green, fair management of the local authority. But obviously, that's got to tie in with people's priorities, immediate priorities, and worries around the cost of living and getting by day to day. So yeah, I mean, as I say, you as you said, it's very early for me in the administration, and I don't want to make promises I can't keep. But please be assured I am having conversations with all the people in the council, the officers, and supporting staff, and seeing finding out what the policies currently are in different areas, and seeing how those policies can be possibly improved and moderated to be more environmentally friendly.
Well, not to put too much of an Angus focus on this, but I do live in Angus. And does this then mean that we're going to be getting more off-road cycleways so that we can get from one town or one place to another, and maybe even a wee route over the Sidlaws to Dundee without having to brave the traffic?
Well, I can't comment specifically on that route, but there is absolutely a lot of funding, much of it coming from the Scottish Government, which is dedicated and ring fenced for active travel routes, and that's something that we have already announced. So there are um, all over the county more active travel routes being funded and. In some cases currently being developed. So yes, that is actually that's a really big priority, and something that we can thank the Scottish Government for, funding wise, in a environment where, as I say, funding is challenging.
So is this something that people from across Scotland are going to be seeing more of then? More active travel routes, more space apart from, away from traffic to be able to cycle safely? Because it's very difficult to go cycling with wee ones on a road where, even with the 20 mile an hour, even with, I do see some reports from elsewhere. I think it's in Edinburgh where they've got sort of cycling trains or cycling buses, you know what I mean? So it's sort of people coming along, and I believe the Lib Dems were quite cross about that. I'm not quite sure why. But I mean, do you think that this we're going to be finding more creative ways for families to get out and get exercise and get cycling safely?
Yeah, and it is absolutely. It's been the Scottish Government's made it very clear that it's actually one of their key priorities in this program for government. Exactly the stuff you've highlighted, and I think in many ways it actually ties in into very practical priorities for people around the cost of fuel. Even if you're not necessarily the keenest cyclist yet, if we can provide the, as you say, crucially safe, accessible, practical, easy to reach paths and routes, I think people are going to use them because they're enjoyable and because it improves your health, but also because fuel and petrol costs are wacky. And so lots of people won't actually feel that running a car is an affordable option in some circumstances. So I think actually everything is going to dovetail. But you're right. We need to really think about people who, for example, aren't particularly experienced cyclists, who are wanting to start cycling, who have families, um, who they want to cycle with, kids who they want to bring onto the roads for the first time and the paths for the first time. So yes, all those things are really, really front and center of my thinking on it.
Well, front and centre of the Tories' focus seems to be their own internal struggles and strife. So for the Conservatives are always saying that Scotland's had its democracy, but they do seem to want to change their minds quite frequently when it comes to their Tory party leaders. Um, so we're having the hustings. They're probably happening as I speak. Oh dear, the Tories are going to be missing our programme because the hustings have started at 7:30. Um, but what do you make of the Tory leadership? Just yet another Tory leadership parade. What do you make of it? I actually heard an anecdote the other day that Nadeem Zahawi was furious with Penny Mordaunt, and nobody could work out why. And then the news was released the next day that um, the Mordaunt campaign appeared to have taken the Zahawi for PM.com site, and if you clicked on it, it took you to Penny Mordaunt's campaign. So I can imagine why Nadeem Zahawi was a bit miffed. But do you think that this kind of actually speaks of the caliber of the Tories, that this is the way that their candidates are behaving?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things there. I think I'll comment on the Tories specifically, believe me, in a minute. But I think it also speaks to the kind of combative, aggressive, cutthroat nature of British politics, and that makes me very sad because I've come across it in my own capacity, but also in council level and at national level. You see that it's very difficult for people to have a civilized competition or a positive debate without dirty tricks or mudslinging or often quite personal comments about each other. I've seen the comments that I believe it's Liz Truss's camp are now criticising Penny Mordaunt's camp and criticising Penny Mordaunt on things. And more in general terms, I think there's really no useful place for that in any political party. The Conservatives do seem to be particularly good at that, but that makes me sad. Um, in terms of the Conservative candidates specifically, I think in a way it doesn't. It's not really relevant to the case for Scottish independence, which of these people ends up being Conservative leader. Um, None of them will have a mandate in Scotland, not only because none of them have we don't get to no one gets to choose who the next prime minister is apart from the Conservative Party, but also because we haven't voted Conservative in Scotland and for a Conservative government since I think 1955. So in that way, it doesn't really matter. The case for Scottish independence stands on its own 2 feet. In terms of the quality and the caliber of the candidates, I mean, what's interesting is that as a woman, I I should be enthusiastic that three of them are women, and I should also be welcoming the fact that there's a good ethnic minority mix, and there's quite a lot of diversity in that respect. But I try to look at it from a values driven point of view, and even Kemi Badenoch, for example, she's relatively young, she's a woman, she's from an ethnic minority background, but her values are not my values. She's actually, in my opinion, incredibly right wing, um, and the least right wing, who I would probably say is probably Tom Tugendhat. You can see that that's not what the Conservative Party MPs or I think membership are going to go for. So I think we're going to end up with another very right wing, populist, quite confrontational leader who's really not what Scotland wants or needs.
It is quite bizarre, isn't it? I mean, I saw Penny Mordaunt's her promotional picture, and it was very very similar to that which was used in satire by Alan Bustard, standing in front of the Union flag, looking quite sort of macho, and it does seem very odd to me that as somebody who grew up with I mean I thought that Margaret Thatcher and Michael Heseltine and um, Ken Baker, I thought that they were the furthest right I'd ever see, and now I hear them and they Michael Heseltine, he sort of sounds almost left of centre, and it does make you wonder how much further to the right the Conservative Party can go, before actually just morphing into UKIP. And I sometimes wonder how that sits with the Conservative Party in Scotland, because although you get the likes of Andrew Bowie and David Duguid, who are complete sort of Tory fanboys when it comes to the sort of the increasingly far right Boris Johnson sort of neoliberalist um, sector or vector, it's there must be quite a lot of old style and old school Conservatives that don't recognise their party. Do you get any sense from sort of the dark corridors you wander in politics? Do you get any sense from the Conservatives that perhaps a split from London is something more of them are considering?
Do you know that's an interesting one because in terms of the Conservative Party moving further and further to the right, yes, I agree. That has happened. It started happening when UKIP put pressure on them, and a large proportion of the Conservative Party panicked that UKIP was going to take some of their votes. So they just tried to take UKIP ground, and that's what's happened. And there were, I think, decent, moral, very accomplished Conservative MPs. I didn't agree with their views on many things, but for example, Dominic Grieve and people like that were shunted out. And I think I would hazard a guess that he doesn't have much love for the current Conservative Party and the values that they hold. So, in response to the Scottish Conservatives, I haven't I haven't really got the sense that there's a great push within the Scottish Conservative Party, and I'm not saying I know anybody well in the party, but I haven't got any kind of impression that they are going to make a concerted effort to split. That their name is the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party. They have a whole special name in Scotland, just to make that point really, really clear. And obviously, Douglas Ross, I've now got to the stage of feeling a bit sorry for him because At first, there was a flip flop, and then there was a flip flop, and now I really can't remember what he thinks. So if I can't remember what he thinks, then I doubt that they've got a really strong position on this.
It's interesting. I haven't seen much of Douglas Ross. Andrew Bowie seems to get wheeled out a bit more. He's obviously a more reliable character as far as the Westminster sector is concerned. But I remember reading something from Professor Tompkins when he was an MSP, and I think at one point he was quite interested in the prospect of the Conservatives in Scotland setting up their own party, and I remember that being met with some delight in the chamber when an SNP WAG asked if that meant that they finally also understood and recognised that it was better to be as far away from London rule as possible. But I guess we'll see where that takes us. So, what do you make of Jim Fairley's assertion that the Scottish leadership candidates and the direction that they're taking us in is toxic for Scottish trade?
Oh, I mean, they're, I think, very similar to what I think the phrase he used. They're trying to out Brexit each other. I think they're um, Suella Braverman, she's now got knocked out. She was standing as the only authentic Brexiteer. Now Liz Truss is saying, no, no, I'm as authentic and I was a Brexiteer from the beginning. And then another one's popping up and being even more Brexity. And I think, as what I said earlier, they're playing to their audience, and their audience is the voters for them, and the voters for them will be the Conservative Party membership. So there's no one in that mix who is anything other than going to continue with the hard, chaotic Brexit that we have on our hands, and that Brexit and many other factors as well is hugely damaging for trade in Scotland. So I completely agree that every single one of them is toxic for Scottish trade, but equally, and the point I made about it not really mattering which leader of the party the Conservatives have, it also doesn't really have a huge impact on Scotland which party leads Westminster, because we saw recently that the Labour Party, so Keir Starmer spoke and talked about Scotland, amongst other things, and he made very clear that there was no chance of reversing Brexit. We've got to suck it up, basically. So really, I think the trade issue is so linked to the EU, being a part of the EU, that our only way to really rebuild trade in a meaningful and sustainable manner is to have an independent Scotland and then apply for EU membership as soon as possible.
So obviously Brexit and loss of the single market has meant that we've lost a marketplace of 500 million people just overnight, and that has been catastrophic for many businesses. And many of the empty shop shelves that we're seeing, for example, is a combination of people are going, well, it's COVID, but actually it's a combination of COVID and Brexit because we just don't have the workers there. I'm hearing lots of stories around Scotland of um, restaurants, hospitality sector that just they're having to close. I know a number of farmers that are ploughing significant amounts of crops back into the ground or just putting them onto the compost heap because they don't have the pickers. Are you getting any sense from within Arbroath, from within your area, um, of the impact that Brexit is having on trade and on jobs and I mean, Arbroath was quite pro. I mean, the voters in Arbroath, it was one of the more Brexity areas. Are you getting any sense that perhaps they're having cause to cry into their smokies a bit more about it? Although
Yeah,
interestingly,
so
actually, most of the smoky producers, I spoke to all the smoky producers, and they all were very pro EU because that was where their main market was.
yeah, it's a really interesting one. I think I will defend Arbroath strongly and say that it is so many different communities within Arbroath, many of whom were predominantly pro EU. You obviously have a strong in the whole of Angus and in Arbroath, you have a strong farming community, and specifically on the coastal towns like Arbroath, very strong fishing and seafood community. I think the fisher people were duped. And Michael Gove, amongst others, made lots of assurances about fishing, which turned out to not be true. And we have seen we in the whole of the UK, but specifically in Scotland and specifically from the ports, we've seen huge problems with Brexit and exporting seafood. And so I would be amazed if the fishermen here were not at least disillusioned. I can't say that they have said to me they do or don't now want to leap back into the EU, but I would be amazed if many of them weren't disillusioned. In the farms around Arbroath, yes, there's problems with um, lack of workers. I mean, different nationalities are now coming in to do the jobs. They are struggling to often to get workers at the right times of year when picking needs to be done, and the places those workers are coming from. Obviously, it's massively been limited by the lack of freedom of movement now. So yes, there are big problems, and we did see. I think it was last year, huge amounts of fruit, in particular berry fruit, um, at risk of going to waste and just being thrown out because there was no one to pick it.
Yeah, so yeah, there's a farm near me that I have on very good authority. They're just taking wheelbarrows of it and dumping it in the compost bins, which it's heartbreaking stuff. Um, a small bit of good news, but still, sort of the heartbreaking end of the scale is this paid leave for babies in neonatal care. I mean, it's obviously it's good news that people are thinking about them, but and is this one of those bits of legislation that perhaps an independent Scotland could see more family friendly policies? Is this a kind of very much a focus that you think would be taken forward, or do you think that this the fact that this is going through Westminster shows that perhaps they aren't going to be completely about rolling back on people's rights if they're going to be extending the rights for these families that have that are going through a terrible amount?
So, one would like to think that Scotland, an independent Scotland, with its own full powers and levers over all aspects of policy, the indications are it would be much more progressive. I think much more looking towards the progressive, very successful small countries in Scandinavia, for example, that by and large do have much better policies around parents and children and the rights and pay and interactions they have in early life. So I think an independent Scotland, I would hope and expect, would be going much more quickly down this kind of route. I mean, I think it's indicative that it was Stuart MacDonald, who's one of our MPs in the SNP, who's been has put this and he's getting it through Westminster. And I understand as well that one of our other MPs, David Linden's talked very publicly about the personal experience he's had in this respect. And so I'm so proud of them for really pushing this. It makes me sad that it is having to be pushed in this way. I think, interestingly, pushing this kind of legislation in the House of Commons is in sharp juxtaposition to the attitudes of the House of Commons when it comes to people, for example, being able to bring their babies into the House of Commons, having family friendly working practices for mums and dads with young babies. I think that is all quite behind the times at Westminster. So it's good to see it going through, but it's a shame that it hasn't happened sooner. And yeah.
So, a little bit more good news, I guess, is the fact that the rail strikes look like, or the reduced timetable is going to be a thing of the past, and that the train drivers have accepted a 5% increase from the Scottish government. Um, do you think that this is going to be an increasing issue as we face the Tory cost of living crisis, with people looking at their paychecks and just not being able to make it through the week? And how do you think governments are going to be able to cope with the Scottish government without having the financial levers of independence, being able to address the cost of living crisis through salaries? How do you see the way ahead?
Yeah, this is a really difficult one because obviously this is one of those areas that's largely reserved with some devolved elements around, for example, social security and employment law. So this is a classic example of it being potentially falling between two stools because we don't have the powers we need to fully address this situation in the round. I think we will probably see more strikes potentially and debate around this. I think in the UK and in Scotland, for exactly the reasons you've highlighted. I think the inequality in society that has been exacerbated by austerity and successive Westminster governments is inevitably going to lead to this situation. And I think you're quite right to say that it's working people, it's not just people who can't work or are not currently working who are going to be facing a complete disaster when it comes to trying to make ends meet on essential items. So I fully support people's right to strike and right to have these robust debates with government. In terms of what we can do, yes, of course, I think that the Scottish government is looking at ways to kind of ameliorate or tackle the cost of living crisis here. But as I said, it's one of those really knotty issues because it falls half in our remit and half not. A bit like drug policy, I think you can't tackle one bit of it effectively without being able to tackle all of it.
Well, I think that's probably sums up many aspects of where we're at the moment with our current constitutional arrangements. So let's watch this space until next October. Um, so that's all we've got time for this evening. I hope you've enjoyed the programme. Please remember to follow Broadcasting Scotland on YouTube and across social media. There are many ways to support this online television channel. You can subscribe, share, give a wee cash donation if you can. My thanks to my guest for this evening, Serena Cowdy, and to you for watching. I'm Ruth Watson. Have a lovely evening.